They always praised my brother until they realized what I'd been doing in silence. It's strange when you realize your family loves the idea of you, but not you. That sentence makes sense in your head until it smacks you in the gut the first time you notice it. For me, it started quietly, almost imperceptibly, in the middle-class suburbs of Seattle, in a house that looked perfect from the outside but carried a subtle chill I'd grow up learning to live with. I'm Ethan, 26 now, but back then I was just a kid who tried really hard to matter and somehow always failed. My parents, David and Marianne, were nice enough people, at least superficially. They loved to host neighborhood barbecues, had a carefully curated Pinterest-worthy kitchen, and always encouraged family time. But underneath all that, there was a hierarchy, and I was somewhere at the bottom. At the top, my older brother, Liam Golden Boy, everything perfect type. He could do no wrong, and if he did, it was endearing. I remember the first time I really noticed it. I was 8 and it was my birthday. I had been hyped for weeks, hoping this year would be different. Maybe I'd get some attention, maybe a little validation. But the morning of my birthday, my parents were fussing over Liam because he just scored the winning touchdown in his Little League championship game. The house was full of balloons for Liam. The chocolate cake in the fridge had his name on it. My birthday, somehow, it got lost in the shadow of his tiny victories. I tried to bring it up gently, in that meek, hopeful way only an 8-year-old can. It's my birthday today. My mom glanced at me over the countertop where she was fawning over Liam's stats, smiled politely, and said, "Yes, Ethan, we'll celebrate later, sweetie." Later never came. That day, I learned a lesson I'd carry into my teens. I could do everything right, but if it wasn't spectacular or loud or associated with Liam, it didn't matter. It wasn't all overt, of course. My parents weren't cruel. There was no yelling or insults, no sharp words. It was subtler than that, a pattern of indifference. I'd spend weeks on a school project, like the time I built a miniature working solar system for the science fair. And the moment I placed it on the table at home, my dad's eyes slid over it as if it were furniture. Meanwhile, Liam walked in with a shiny little football trophy he'd accidentally dropped in the hallway, and suddenly the whole living room erupted in applause. "That's my boy," my mom cheered, clapping him on the back. I remember feeling a sharp pang in my chest and forcing a smile. "Good job, Liam," I said softly, the kind of smile that begged to be noticed but was never returned. By the time I hit middle school, the pattern had become painfully obvious. My parents cheered at every football game Liam played, every basketball tryout he attended. They attended every piano recital he considered, while mine, the ones I'd begged them to watch, went unnoticed. I learned to perform silently, like a ghost haunting the same house, trying to exist without disrupting the narrative of the perfect family. School plays were worse. I had a knack for drama, could memorize lines easily, and genuinely enjoyed performing. One year, I landed the lead in my 5th grade play. I was thrilled. I told my parents about it, sent home the little flyer from school, and waited for that proud look, that smile of acknowledgement. On the night of the play, I peeked into the audience. My parents weren't there. Liam had a basketball tournament that evening, and of course that took precedence. I went on stage, delivered every line with the same enthusiasm, and received the loudest applause from teachers and friends. It felt hollow, without my parents in the crowd. Even the small kindnesses I did around the house went unnoticed. I would help my mom clean the kitchen after dinner or carry groceries in from the car without being asked. My dad never said thank you. Liam could spill juice all over the floor, and my mom would sigh indulgently, muttering, "He's just like his father." That should have made me feel included. I was trying to fit the mold, trying to be part of the family's love somehow, but instead, it made me feel smaller, invisible. There was a strange turning point during my teenage years. I was 14, awkwardly tall, with braces and glasses, trying to navigate the treacherous waters of high school, while also dealing with the tidal waves of family neglect. That year, I got a perfect score on my SAT subject test, my first real academic achievement that genuinely reflected my effort. I was proud, maybe too proud to keep it inside. When I brought the results home, I expected at least a congratulatory nod. Instead, my parents were too busy fussing over Liam's football scholarship letter. "We're so proud of him," they cheered, showing the letter to anyone who would look, hanging it on the fridge like it was a national treasure. I placed my test scores next to it, trying to hide the disappointment on my face. They didn't even glance at it. It was a recurring motif in my life. Liam's wins were celebrated, mine ignored. And it didn't just affect me, it bled into my social interactions too. I became cautious, quieter, careful not to demand attention or validation because experience had taught me it was futile. I watched my parents beam over Liam's charm and confidence and learned early that in order to exist in their eyes, one must either be larger than life or invisible. Some might call it favoritism, others parental oversight. But for me, it felt like emotional neglect, a cold kind of hurt that sneaks in under your skin. There were moments when I'd try to confront it at dinner, during family outings, or even in casual conversations. "Why don't you ever ask me about school?" I'd ask, hoping for an acknowledgement. And the response was always polite, dismissive, or redirected back to Liam. "We know you're doing fine, Ethan. How's Liam doing?" That question, constantly repeated, became the soundtrack of my youth. I remember one night vividly, a Sunday. Rainy, typical Seattle gloom. I was 16, lying on my bed, staring at the ceiling. Liam had just returned from a weekend football tournament where he'd scored another game-winning touchdown. My parents hovered over him like he was a rare artifact, hanging on every word he said, laughing at every joke. I sat in the corner of the room, a book in my hands, reading because it was safer than attempting conversation. I realized then, with a sudden quiet clarity, that I didn't need their validation. I could excel quietly. I could build a life that mattered without applause, without their nods of approval. And yet, it hurt. It hurt more than I could explain. There were nights when I cried silently in my pillow, wishing just once that they would see me, not Liam, not the perfect son in their eyes, but me. It was a strange, lonely kind of ache, the kind that doesn't leave scars but lingers in your posture, your tone, your hesitant smile. I learned to mask it with humor, with sarcasm, and later with independence. By the time I graduated high school, I had mastered the art of fading into the background. I could be present without being noticed. I could help without being thanked. I could succeed without their applause. And in many ways, that independence became my armor, the one thing Liam could never take from me. But beneath it all, the pain never fully went away. It was the quiet echo in family dinners, the invisible chair I sat in while everyone else clinked glasses over Liam's achievements. It was the realization that love, at least the way my parents showed it, wasn't always about the person. It was about the version of them they wanted to see. And I was just a shadow. That shadow, however, learned to observe, learned to listen, learned to wait. And even though I didn't know it at 16, those years of invisibility would eventually teach me something more valuable than praise. Self-reliance, resilience, and the understanding that sometimes the recognition you crave most doesn't come from others, it comes from yourself. So yeah, I grew up invisible, unnoticed, underappreciated, and yet despite every ignored science fair, every forgotten birthday, every dinner table where I was the quiet one in the corner, I survived. And maybe, just maybe, that quiet survival would become the foundation for the person I was meant to be, someone who didn't need anyone's applause to know his worth. At my graduation, my parents cheered louder for a name that wasn't mine. I know it sounds dramatic, but it's the truth. I walked across that stage, cap and gown, stiff and itchy, heart pounding, hoping for at least one look of pride, one clap from the people who were supposed to care about me the most. Instead, my parents' faces were glued to their phones, updating a group chat with family friends about Liam's latest MBA acceptance letter. My own name felt like a whisper in a crowded room, and in a way, that's exactly what I was to them, a whisper. College was strange. I had earned my spot at a good engineering school, a place I was genuinely excited about. It was Seattle, which meant I could stay close to home, but also carve my own path away from the shadows. And yet, even as I excelled academically, my parents barely noticed. Liam, on the other hand, was the star of every conversation. Every dinner, every call home, every text from my mom was about his success. I tried to be happy for him. I really did. I just never expected anyone to notice me in the process. To make things even more complicated, I had to support myself. My parents didn't question it. They assumed Liam needed all their resources, all their attention. I worked part-time at a local coffee shop, juggling classes, late-night shifts, and projects that demanded every ounce of my focus. There were nights I'd collapse into my tiny apartment, exhausted and alone, but with the satisfaction of knowing I was building something for myself, even if no one else seemed to care. And then came the first family emergencies that weren't emergencies at all, at least not for me. Liam started failing courses, hiding grades, and panicking about how it would affect his scholarship. For some reason, guilt, love, a desire to protect my family's image, I helped him. I tutored him in engineering and math, stayed up late explaining formulas, made cheat sheets he'd studied himself. It was exhausting and frankly unfair. I began to realize that while my parents swooned over his brilliance, they completely ignored mine, even when I silently carried their favorite child on my back. It was around this time that Sophie entered my life. She wasn't loud, didn't demand attention, and had a way of noticing the unnoticed. I met her at a campus art exhibition I'd wandered in because I needed a break from my mechanical drawings and equations. She was sketching, sitting cross-legged on the floor, headphones in, completely absorbed in her work. I didn't even know why I sat next to her, but we started talking. She laughed at my terrible attempts at small talk, and I found myself smiling, genuinely. For the first time, I felt seen. Not for achievement, not for grades, not for some version of me. They wanted just me. Sophie became my anchor, my reality check, my reason to believe that maybe being unnoticed by my family didn't define my worth. After college, I got my first real job in Seattle, a mechanical engineering position at a mid-sized firm that actually valued what I brought to the table. I rented a small apartment near the waterfront, painted the walls my favorite colors, bought a plant that I almost killed 3 times, and started to build a life of my own. I called my parents to share the news. "That's great, Ethan," my dad said in that detached tone that somehow made encouragement feel like an obligation. "We're glad for you." But they didn't visit, didn't ask to see my apartment, didn't take pictures or brag to anyone. Meanwhile, Liam had a fully furnished apartment with a balcony and city view, all covered with family money and attention. He'd just gotten engaged, and suddenly the entire family revolved around him again. I went to Liam's engagement dinner, the first time in years I truly felt like a ghost in my own family. My parents beamed as he stood there, showing off the ring, discussing plans, and laughing at jokes only they seemed to find funny. I sat at the end of the table, quietly sipping my water, forcing smiles, nodding when prompted. Every laugh, every toast, every proud glance my parents gave him was a punch to the gut. I loved my brother. I was happy for him, but for once, I couldn't ignore how little they cared about me. And yet, amidst the discomfort, I noticed something strange. I wasn't hurt in the same way anymore. The years of being invisible had trained me to survive, to find validation elsewhere. Sophie's smile, my small apartment, my job, those things grounded me. I had built a life that mattered, independent of their recognition. I could step into that dinner and watch the attention fall elsewhere, and it wouldn't break me, at least not completely, but it did hurt. And I realized that no amount of personal success could fully erase the echoes of a childhood where my accomplishments were invisible. Every forgotten birthday, every ignored science fair, every silent dinner table was still a weight I carried. It wasn't resentment, exactly. It was more like a shadow, one that followed me, occasionally darkening moments that should have been joyous. And yet, I had learned how to carry it. I learned to smile politely, nod when needed, and then retreat into my own world where I was celebrated for who I was. In that moment, at Liam's engagement dinner, I felt like I had become my own family. And for someone who had spent years being unseen, that was a victory of its own. It's funny the way life works. You spend years craving attention from people who will never give it. And then one day you realize you don't need it. You realize that your life, your accomplishments, your worth don't depend on their approval. You can build, you can love, you can live quietly, independently, fully. I remember walking back to my apartment that night, rain softly falling on the streets of Seattle, lights reflecting off the wet pavement. I thought about everything I had done to help Liam, every unnoticed triumph, every silent achievement. And for the first time in a long time, I felt proud. Not proud because my parents were proud of me, but because I had done it for myself and it had mattered. Sophie greeted me at the door, still sketching in her little notebook, and I felt a flicker of relief. In her eyes, I was visible. I was real. And for now, that was enough. The ghost who graduated had survived the world of the living uncheered, unnoticed, overlooked, but intact. And even though my family still saw Liam as their golden boy, I had learned the first real lesson in self-worth. Sometimes being invisible isn't a curse. Sometimes it's a quiet preparation for the life you'll finally claim for yourself. The golden boy finally fell, and suddenly they remembered I existed. It's a strange, almost surreal feeling when someone you spent your entire life living in the shadow of starts crumbling, and your parents, who never noticed you before, suddenly look at you like you're a lifeline. I'd spent years quietly building a life for myself, cultivating independence, and learning to measure my worth outside of my family's approval. And yet, nothing could have prepared me for the moment when Liam, the perfect golden boy, started unraveling. By this point, I was 28, established as a mechanical engineer at a reputable firm in Seattle. My apartment had a view of the waterfront, my plants thrived, and Sophie and I had a small but happy life together. Everything I did on my terms. I didn't need their recognition anymore. I had learned to survive without it. Liam, on the other hand, was the picture of perfection on the surface. His business, which he'd hyped up relentlessly, began to fail. Clients disappeared, contracts fell through, and debts piled up. His marriage, which had been picture perfect at engagements and social events, started showing cracks that couldn't be hidden behind social media filters. And for the first time in my life, my parents were panicked, genuinely, uncomfortably, visibly panicked. The first call came late one night. My phone buzzed, and the name on the screen made my stomach sink. Mom. I answered, expecting a casual, "How are you?" or some veiled discussion about Liam's accomplishments. Instead, I was met with the sharp edge of desperation. "Ethan, we need your help," she said, voice trembling in a way I'd never heard before. "It's Liam. His business. He's in trouble." I leaned back in my chair, feeling a rush of conflicting emotions, concern, annoyance, and that old, familiar resentment that had never fully disappeared. "Mom, what exactly do you need me to do?" I asked cautiously. We don't know what to do. His debts, the bank, everything is falling apart. Can you help him?" I could hear the panic in her voice, the unspoken truth that this wasn't just about Liam's life crumbling. It was about their image, the golden child they had built up for years, now threatening to shatter. I took a deep breath. "All right," I said quietly. "Send me all the statements and documents. I'll see what I can do." The next few weeks were a blur. I went through every bill, every loan, every missed payment. I discovered that Liam had been lying for years, hiding failures, masking debts, pretending everything was perfect. And here I was, the quiet kid who had always been ignored, tasked with cleaning up his mess. The irony was almost painful. I'd spent my childhood invisible, overlooked, and now I was the one holding the pieces together while the world finally noticed me. Not for achievements, but because the person they idolized was faltering. I worked tirelessly, contacting creditors, negotiating payment plans, and finding ways to stabilize his finances without letting anyone outside the family know how deep the hole ran. Liam never asked for help. He was too proud. But I could see it in the lines of his face, in the tense set of his shoulders, in the way he avoided my gaze. It hurt me to see him struggle, but it also stirred up years of resentment. How many times had I helped him in secret before, silently, only to have my parents cheer for him? How many times had I been invisible while he thrived on borrowed attention? Finally, one evening, the confrontation happened. Liam and I were sitting in my apartment, papers spread across the table, the soft hum of the city outside providing a quiet backdrop. I could feel the tension building, ready to snap. "Why didn't you tell them?" I asked, voice low but steady. "Why hide this for so long?" He looked up, face pale, eyes haunted. I didn't want them to worry. I didn't want them to see me fail. You wouldn't understand." I laughed bitterly, a sound that made him flinch. "Understand? Liam, I've understood everything for years. I've been the one fixing your mess since middle school. I've been the invisible one, cleaning up after the golden boy. I've carried you without anyone noticing me. And now you lie to everyone, just like always." He opened his mouth to respond, but I didn't let him. "Do you know what it feels like to be invisible? To have every accomplishment, every bit of effort ignored while they hand you applause and awards you never earned? I've been there, Liam. I know that feeling." For the first time, I saw him break, not the angry, defensive Liam, but the scared, vulnerable one. "Ethan, I didn't think, you didn't think, because it's always been easy for you, and it's always been easy for them to love the idea of you, but never me. But I'm tired, Liam. I'm tired of being the ghost, the invisible one, the one who cleans up your mistakes while the world cheers for you." We sat in silence, the kind that only happens when truths you've held in your chest for years finally spill out. And then it happened. My parents walked in. They had come to check on the situation, probably to see if their favorite son was safe, and they froze. They froze in the doorway, and for the first time in my life, they really saw me, not as the quiet observer, not as a shadow, not as Liam's sidekick, but as a human being with anger, hurt, and integrity. You helped him?" My dad asked, voice shaking. All this time, I looked at them, feeling the weight of years pressing down, and said the words I had rehearsed 1,000 times in my head, but never dared to speak aloud. "You only notice me when your favorite falls apart." The room was silent. My parents didn't know what to say. My brother, the golden boy, sat there quietly, finally understanding what it meant to be seen for who I really was. The anger, the hurt, the years of being overlooked, it all came to the surface, but instead of shouting or screaming, I let the silence do its work. That night, Liam and I stayed up, talking for hours. Not about their mistakes, not about resentment, but about honesty, about boundaries, about rebuilding. And in that quiet conversation, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. A sense of power that didn't come from attention or applause, but from finally being heard, finally being seen. By the time my parents left, their faces pale and their words hesitant, I realized that this was the first time I'd ever had the upper hand in our family dynamics. Not through manipulation, not through pride, but simply by existing, speaking truth and refusing to be invisible any longer. And for the first time in my life, I felt whole in a way that had nothing to do with being the golden child. I was Ethan, the quiet one, the invisible one, the one they had overlooked for years, and finally I existed on my own terms. I didn't need their praise anymore, but when it finally came, I didn't know what to do with it. After the confrontation with my parents and Liam's collapse, I knew I had to take a step back. For the first time, I distanced myself not out of anger, though there was plenty of that, but to figure out who I was without their approval hanging over me like some invisible, suffocating weight. Therapy became my sanctuary. The first session felt almost absurd sitting on a couch, talking to someone about feelings I'd spent years burying. I told her everything, the birthdays nobody remembered, the dinners where I was invisible, the years of cleaning up after Liam while my parents cheered for him. She listened. That was the important part. And slowly, I started to understand that my worth wasn't tied to their attention. My life, my achievement, my happiness, they were mine. And for the first time, I let myself feel proud of my quiet victories. The raise at work, the projects I led successfully, the apartment Sophie and I had built together, the little plant in the corner that refused to die despite my neglect, they all mattered. Not to them, not to Liam, but to me. Sophie became more than my anchor. She became my mirror. She reflected back the value I'd long forgotten I had. When I doubted myself, she reminded me gently that I was competent, kind, resilient, qualities that no amount of parental praise could amplify. She laughed at my sarcastic jokes, admired my stubborn streak, and somehow always knew when to let me be invisible and when to push me to be seen. With her, I learned that validation could come from love, understanding, and shared life, not just from family. And yet, the ghosts of my past weren't entirely gone. I still felt the occasional sting when Liam mentioned my parents in a casual way, or when I glimpsed them celebrating something trivial about him online. But now, the pain was tempered by perspective. I had built a life where my happiness didn't hinge on their recognition, and that made the occasional pang manageable. Then, one rainy afternoon, they came to my door unannounced. I wasn't expecting them, and honestly, I wasn't sure I wanted them here. I opened the door, and for the first time in years, I saw something different in their eyes: humility, genuine uncertainty, and dare I say, remorse. "Ethan," my mom began, voice soft, almost trembling, we we need to apologize. I blinked. I wasn't sure if this was a setup for something awkward, some manipulative attempt to regain my favor, but the look on their faces told me this was different. No grand gestures, no over-the-top proclamations, just human beings, broken, flawed, and finally aware of the harm they'd caused. "We see now," my dad added quietly, "that we've spent so much time celebrating the wrong things, the wrong person, and we overlooked you. All these years, we overlooked you." I felt a surge of emotion. I hadn't anticipated: anger, relief, sadness, and something else I couldn't quite name. For the first time, they weren't cheering because of achievements they could brag about. They weren't praising a version of me they liked better than reality. They were acknowledging that their love had been flawed, that it had been conditional in ways I had spent years navigating. I took a deep breath. Forgiveness didn't come instantly, and I made it clear. "I forgive you," I said slowly, "but things have to be different now. I can't be invisible anymore, and I won't accept being sidelined. We can have a relationship, but it has to be real, not just convenient." They nodded quietly without argument. It felt like progress, like we were finally seeing each other without the weight of pretense. Liam, meanwhile, was changing too. The humbling experience of losing everything, of being confronted with the consequences of his lies and arrogance, had softened him. He no longer assumed that my support and his parents' indulgence were guarantees. He started rebuilding, not flashy, not for show, but honestly, responsibly. And slowly, he began to see me not as the sidekick, not as the quiet observer, but as a brother who had always been there, who had always mattered even when no one else noticed. The transformation in our family wasn't instantaneous, and it wasn't perfect. There were awkward silences, tentative conversations, and moments when the old patterns threatened to creep back. But there was also honesty, recognition, and a fragile, growing respect. For the first time, I felt like a participant, not a spectator, in my own family. Sophie and I often sat together in our apartment, looking out at the city lights reflecting off the wet streets, and talked about all of it: the years of invisibility, the quiet victories, the moments we thought we'd never heal from. And in those conversations, I realized that the most important thing I had learned wasn't about Liam, wasn't about my parents, wasn't about the golden child dynamic at all. It was about me, about understanding my value, claiming my space, and refusing to let years of neglect define my self-worth. There's a kind of liberation in that, a quiet, understated freedom that feels almost revolutionary. I could be proud, be seen, be loved, and not need anyone's approval to validate my existence. I could shine without a spotlight, and so I did. Sometimes I catch myself thinking about my childhood birthdays, the dinners where I was invisible, the science fairs and small triumphs no one noticed. And I smile, because those moments don't define me anymore. They taught me resilience, independence, and the ability to cherish the quiet victories that nobody else sees. Maybe I was never the golden child. Maybe Liam was the one who got the spotlight, the applause, and the recognition. But I was the one who learned how to shine without it. And in the end, that made all the difference. I don't need anyone's applause to know my worth. I don't need validation to feel proud. I don't need to be cheered for, because the life I built, the person I've become, and the love I share with Sophie are more than enough. And when my parents finally, hesitantly, gave me the recognition they should have years ago, I realized something. I didn't need it, but I could accept it now, with grace, without letting it define me. That, more than anything, was the victory I had waited my whole life for. All right, that's it for today. I hope you enjoyed the story. We have so many more amazing stories coming your way, so make sure you hit that subscribe button. Our goal is to reach 100K subscribers by the end of this year, and we love for you to be part of this journey. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next story.